Welcome to My To Hacker podcast. And today we have a very special guest, Dominic D'Agostino. Welcome.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate you accepted our invitation. And naturally, the main subject will be ketogenic diet. And can you please first, very short intro, like, who are you and how did you get into this whole ketogenic diet craziness?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, my background, I trained, going a little bit farther back. As an undergrad, I focused on nutrition and I wanted to do a career in nutritional sciences. And throughout my training in nutrition science as an undergraduate, or just college level, entry college level, I realized there wasn't a whole lot of jobs. And in 1990s, it was like the decade of the brain. So I applied to a PhD program that was neuroscience and also physiology. And it was specifically, I studied the control of breathing. So I studied the neural control of autonomic regulation, how our brain senses not only carbon dioxide, but also senses oxygen. So we have oxygen chemoreceptors, the carotid bodies at the bifurcation of the common carotid artery, but we also have O2 sensing neurons in the brain in the rostral ventral lateral medulla and a pre-Botzinger complex in the brainstem. And I studied that for my PhD. And during my PhD, studying respiratory control, or how we can modulate our respiration in response to different extreme environments like hypoxia, I became interested in diving, scuba diving, or dive training. And then that led to a postdoctoral fellowship funded by the military, Office of Navy Research, to study oxygen toxicity seizures. And at the time, I didn't really think of nutrition as a way as a countermeasure to prevent or delay oxygen toxicity seizures, which limits Navy SEAL diving because they use a closed circuit rebreather with high concentrations of oxygen. Central nervous system oxygen toxicity is also a limitation of hyperbaric oxygen therapy, which is used for 14 different FDA approved applications. Not yet for cancer, although we study cancer, although it is used for radiation necrosis associated with cancer. So we study that. That's another topic, cancer. So as I delved more into how to prevent these oxygen toxicity seizures, I was mostly focused on drugs and also antioxidant compounds that can prevent oxygen-free radicals in response to an increased oxygenation or hyperoxygenation in the brain. And the thoughts were that if we could attenuate the reactive oxygen species in response to increased tissue PO2, then we could prevent the seizures from happening. But the more I looked into it, I saw all of this was under mitochondrial control, because the mitochondria were actually the source of the oxygen-free radicals, namely superoxide anion, which then led to more reactive intermediates that altered the gating properties of neurons in our brain cells, causing a membrane potential depolarization and increased excitability from a global perspective that could trigger a seizure in specific brain regions. So if I could control the mitochondria with various substrates, and I was actually interested in lactate at one thing and modulating glycolytic control. But then I discovered the ketogenic diet, and it was strange that I'd never thought about using a ketogenic diet for seizures before, because my early training in nutrition as an undergrad really did not look favorably upon the ketogenic diet. And I don't even think we talked about it for seizure control, which is a standard of care for drug-resistant epilepsy. So I'm kind of making a long story out of this, but I shifted my focus from drugs to nutrition, namely the ketogenic diet and ketone supplements, in about 2008 or 9. And it's been about over a decade that I have been intensely studying the neuroprotective effects of the ketogenic diet for extreme environments, which would be the undersea environment, We also do some work relevant to space. We also do work with cancer, and we also do work with neurometabolic diseases and even genetic diseases that are responsive to ketogenic diet therapies. That they're responsive because it's altering brain energy metabolism. The ketones also change the neuropharmacology of a brain in ways that can symptomatically at least treat some of these disorders, as far as like seizures and motor function and things like that, and perhaps even neuroinflammation. But my main project has always been funded by the Navy, and it still continues to be developing and optimizing a ketogenic therapy. That could be a ketogenic diet. It could be ketone supplementation, and there's many different forms. Intermittent fasting is something that, you know, we're kind of interested in too, and variations of these things under certain conditions to delay oxygen toxicity and make various diving operations safer, and also to increase what we call performance resilience. So maintaining a level of performance even under situations where the person would be in a seizure or performance would break down. So if we could maintain that physical and cognitive performance in environmental extremes, that's sort of the objective. And if we can do it without drugs, that's much more favorable path to go, because some of the anti-seizure drugs that I was interested in, you know, 10 years ago, and I think there's still application for them, they tend to delay your cognitive function, and they tend to also impair your physical performance. So the idea now is to develop an anti-seizure, neuroprotective, ketogenic strategy that can either optimize or just not influence physical performance in any negative way. So we're in the process of doing that now. We're doing rat studies and human studies, actually.
So when you mention human studies, are you one of the subject who is, because you are known for so there are those kind of scientists that they not only study the very subject, but they become the test subject. And you know, it has a long history of those people, if you think about, but you became one of those, as I understand.
Yeah, you know, even back over 10 years ago when I started studying the diet, I personally wanted to experience what it felt like to being in a state of ketosis, just so I could, I was interested in nutrition to begin with, and so it wasn't really a difficult thing for me to do, although the ketogenic diet was much more calculated and much more of a precision diet than any other diet I had followed previously. The definition of a ketogenic diet is a diet that can elevate your blood ketones. If someone's calling a ketogenic diet, but they do not have an elevated and sustained hyperketonemia, which you can measure in the blood, in the breath, and in the urine, then that diet is not a ketogenic diet. And to achieve that state of therapeutic ketosis, that's very effective for seizures, it involves a pretty significant shift in the macronutrient composition of your diet, being very, very high in fat, moderate to low in protein. It's not a high protein diet, and like virtually no carbohydrates. So I was motivated to do that back in 2008 or 9. And, you know, I probably didn't get it perfected until about 2009 or 10, because there's like a learning curve to basically implementing this properly, even with all the resources you have, which we're trying to make it implementation a lot easier. And I have to say that I have actually enjoyed being a test subject on the NASA's Extreme Environment Mission Operations, which is a space analog that NASA has under the water to train astronauts, but they bring on scientists to be part of the research. So I had an opportunity to do that. And my wife actually had the opportunity to do that on the next mission that we did. So I think it's important that scientists really immerse themselves into their science, and to gain a full appreciation and understanding about something like a nutritional protocol. I think it's very important for a scientist to be able to, you know, physically, cognitively experience this metabolic state. And I think that gives them insight into developing and further advancing therapies that are not only more efficacious, but offer the patient an easier option for implementation, because there's some forms of the ketogenic diet that are very difficult to follow. But as we learn more about the ketogenic diets and ways to tweak it and modify it, we can engineer a diet with different foods and macronutrient ratios that would be relatively easy for people to follow and for the average person to follow with the right instruction. So that's what we're interested in doing, and making the ketogenic diet more accessible to people, people with different disorders, but also people like in the fitness realm and everyday individuals who want to feel better and use this dietary approach as a tool, understanding there are many different diets and different tools that people can follow. But for me personally, a ketogenic diet is very liberating. Logistically, it's very feasible because I don't get hungry. I feel like I have more energy, you know, and it kind of works with my biology. Not everybody is going to adapt the same way.
Isn't that the beauty of it? That so I see two great benefits. One of them is we can talk about any kind of diet, but this one is measurable. So as you mentioned that, you know, are you in ketosis or not? That's a simple question, right? And in most diets, there are any numbers you can work with. We just say like, oh, I'm doing Mediterranean or whatever, but here you can measure. So that's one thing. And the second, what you mentioned, that when you are mainly running on fat, let's put it this way, then the insulin remains low, so hunger is more controlled, right? So basically, most of the problems with unsuccessful fat loss programs is the insulin is not controlled, so people get hungry. Let's put it this way. So do you see the same way?
Yeah, that's a good point. So your body makes ketones through the suppression of the hormone insulin. By suppressing the hormone insulin and keeping it low and stable, that stimulates fatty acid oxidation in the muscles, but also in the liver. And you have accelerated fat oxidation in the liver. And by virtue of increased beta oxidation of fatty acids in the liver, you get these ketone bodies that spill into the bloodstream. And then they can fuel the majority of tissues in your body, including your heart and your brain. And I think there's a major advantage to running off that fuel source under many different scenarios, you know, with limited food availability, limited carbohydrate availability. I just completed a 3-day fast that had just ended. Yesterday was my first day of eating after 3 days. And during that time, I got a lot of work done, and I felt my mental clarity was very high, and even my physical energy levels were very high if I kept the fast to a 3-day. You know, I haven't done a 7-day fast in a long time, but just not eating for 3 days, at least in a normal, healthy individual, did not produce any impairment in my energy levels, cognitive or physical. And by suppressing insulin signaling and keeping it low, everything was very stable. I didn't have any highs or lows or any fluctuations during that entire time. And when you're on a ketogenic diet, essentially that's the same thing that happens because there's no postprandial spikes in glucose levels or insulin. And when you do that, your energy flow is very stable and you are stimulating the mitochondria in ways that make them work harder because they have to oxidize. There's less reliance on glycolysis and more reliance on mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation, which is deriving energy using oxygen and deriving energy primarily from fats and ketone bodies, especially in the brain, because the blood-brain barrier doesn't really limits the amount of fats that can get into the brain. But we break down these fats into small water-soluble molecules called beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate. And they largely replace glucose as the primary source of brain energy when you're on a strict ketogenic diet or when you're fasting. And the
original idea was basically that we run on glucose, right? So especially
Yeah.
brain and pretty much everything else should get a certain amount, otherwise we are dead. So even like, in the 1800s, there was an idea that, or maybe earlier, that if you go without food over like 2, 3 days, you practically die.
Yeah.
And
Well, I mean, historically, we know that's not the case, with different individuals
Mhm.
limiting, with limited resources would go quite some time, but it wasn't really experimentally investigated thoroughly and published until like 1967 by George Cahill at Harvard
Mhm.
Medical School. He fasted subjects that were overweight, borderline obese for 40 days. And he looked at the AV difference between what the brain uses, looking at fuel partitioning in the brain. He measured a lot of different parameters. What's interesting is that there's very powerful homeostatic mechanisms that maintain your blood glucose. So your blood glucose may fall from 5 millimolar to 3 or 2 millimolar and then stay there because if you're breaking down triglycerides, the glycerol backbone of the triglyceride is gluconeogenic, so
Mhm.
that can maintain. You also have proteolytic enzymes that
Mhm.
can break down muscle, but muscle protein catabolism slows down with ketones. So you have gluconeogenic amino acids that are being released from your muscle and your liver and your GI, and that maintains some amount of glucose. But what's interesting is that the ketone bodies are anti-catabolic and anti-proteolytic. So they prevent the muscle from catabolizing its amino acids for glucose. So they're very protein sparing. So fat, by virtue of hyperketonemia and ketones, the liberation of fat then becomes anti-catabolic to skeletal muscle.
Mhm.
And that is a key aspect of our biology and physiology that allowed us to undergo periods of famine and to be able to survive.
Mhm.
And also we're omnivores, so we have many different foods to choose from, and that also led very greatly to our ability to survive under periods of limited resources. So so yeah, there are many different aspects of ketones that I have begun to appreciate over the years. Not only are they an alternative fuel to glucose, although glucose is always steady at a low level when you're fasting or on the ketogenic diet, but ketone bodies have signaling properties. They have their own receptors. They have their own transporters, although they share the transporter with lactate, the monocarboxylic acid transporters that they share, and they have important signaling properties, for example, suppressing the NLRP3 inflammasome, which is an inflammatory complex that's when it's activated, when it assembles and then becomes activated, it contributes to systemic inflammation in the body. It also contributes to autoimmune disorders. Autoimmune disorders are often associated with activation of this inflammasome.
Mhm.
So if you can keep it suppressed, it could potentially help age-related chronic diseases and autoimmune diseases that are associated with systemic inflammation.
Mhm.
So we have an endogenous metabolite, beta hydroxybutyrate, which now we can get through exogenous sources. There are supplements that can essentially function like a hormone or a drug and hit specific receptors or different signaling pathways, and maybe even has epigenetic functions.
Mhm.
We know there's the ketone bodies can activate genetic programs that can confer resistance against a wide variety of stimuli that would be damaging. Oxidative stress, for example, neuroprotective pathways are activated by ketone bodies. So
Mhm.
this is kind of where we're focusing a lot of our attention now, but still starting to understand or still exploring the role of ketone bodies as a fuel source, but really putting a lot of time and effort into understanding ketone bodies as a signaling molecule too.
Mhm. So basically, can we say that probably ketone bodies are also seems like they are the fourth macronutrients, or that would be a little bit too much?
Yeah, some people call alcohol the fourth macronutrient. But yeah, I think one could say that ketone bodies, when consumed orally, they are calorie containing macronutrient analogs that when they're consumed, they can give the body energetic form of energy. And so they need to be classified probably because now, unlike 10 years ago, we didn't have exogenous ketones. So now we have a fuel source that we can consume, and we can perhaps use these to fuel exercise, intensity under certain conditions, under certain contexts. They may offer an advantage. So yeah, I think the federal government or USDA, FDA will need to classify. They have not yet done this, but they'll need to classify exogenous ketones as something, as a form of nutrition, because they're really heading in that direction.
So when somebody is on a ketogenic diet and got already adapted, so that's of course two different issues. But if you measure, your background is breathing physiology, right? So if you measure, like, let's say, respiratory exchange ratio, would that change in the favor of let's say, closer to 0.7, so more like full on fat?
Yeah, that has not been sufficiently examined, the respiratory ratio, but it should be somewhere around like between 0.7 and 0.8. I believe. So we know that people on a ketogenic diet that are keto adapted, their respiratory, their ratio is about 0.7 if they're fully keto adapted. And if they're more glycolytic, they're like at 0.9, 0.95, and like sugar burners.
But that's very important, right?
Yeah.
I just saw, I think it's from Inigo San Milan and Brooks, a research paper from 2018, probably, I'm not sure. And they are measuring with top level athletes, RER measurement, but also lactate levels they're measuring. And they see heights. It's basically when somebody's less fat adapted, they lactate is higher all the time.
Yeah.
And as I understand, what they proposing is probably, it's for an athlete it's performance, but for an average person it's about health.
Yeah. So that becomes, it depends what your goal is. And I have this conversation a lot because I don't think carbohydrates and sugar are necessarily bad. I think it's good for your body to have metabolic flexibility. Also looking at it, I do tend to look at it from an evolutionary perspective, is that we had fairly limited access to sugars and forms of carbohydrates that would cause a very profound increase in glucose and insulin. These were not really available. So if they are consumed repeatedly, they start to cause metabolic derangement in individuals. But athletes are kind of, resilient to this to some extent. But even if a high-performance athlete continues to bolus sugars and carbohydrates over time, they will start to become insulin resistant and start to have, athletes that even have 4 to 6 hours of output per day on high-carb diets can start to show overt signs of hyperinsulinemia and type 2 diabetes. So we've seen this. So I think it's good for people to have metabolic flexibility, to be able to digest, assimilate, and utilize all macronutrient sources, including, but the problem is that the large majority of people are not fat adapted, and just by virtue of the dietary guidelines, by virtue of food availability, carbohydrate availability, we essentially silence a metabolic program, or maybe even an epigenetic program, by never going into a state of nutritional ketosis or even fasting ketosis. Some people say, well, fasting is dangerous, it's unnatural. I would say it's very unnatural never to fast at all. Like if you're always eating 3 to 6 meals a day, like most Americans are, high carbohydrate meals, the body never enters a state of nutritional ketosis or fasting ketosis that we know offer many benefits. And in America, and I know in Hungary too, to some extent, although not as much as in America, type 2 diabetes and obesity is astronomically high and a huge healthcare burden. and simply changing the macronutrient ratios or the guidelines of those ratios can be a first step in changing people's metabolisms to shift their RER to a more fat adapted state, which confers many benefits over time.
Some of the critics are saying that if you get, let's say, too much adapted to fat, you're losing the other type of metabolic flexibility to sugars, to carbohydrates. And so in case you're eating sugar, suddenly you're showing signs of being diabetic.
Yeah, so that's a good point. This comes up often. And so if you are carb adapted, if you are adapted to eating carbohydrates and sugar all the time, you become fat intolerant, which means your triglycerides are high and you are become physiologically fat intolerant to where you're not metabolizing fat for energy. If you eat fat all the time and no carbohydrates, you become carbohydrate intolerant or physiological insulin resistance. I think it's more damaging to be fat intolerant and to have high triglycerides due to high carbohydrate consumption will lead to higher levels of insulin, and it'll block fatty acid oxidation and your triglycerides will be high. That's damaging. On a ketogenic diet, in some people, not me, because my glucose runs pretty low, like in the 60s and even in the 50s and the 40s when I was fasting. And then I challenged myself with 200 grams of carbohydrates from things like popcorn and watermelon and dark chocolate. And I never got above like 120, milligrams per day. I never got above like 5 millimolar, 5 or 6, even with a spike. So for me, at least, and I think for a lot of people, there's a moderation that needs to happen too. But if you are on a super strict ketogenic diet for long periods of time, and then you reintroduce carbohydrates, like at the same level that you're consuming before, your postprandial elevation in glucose and insulin perhaps may be higher than it would otherwise. Because if you have a factory and the factory is making this product, and then you basically force the factory to make another product, which, if you're feeding it fat and then you try to feed it glucose, you're going to get an exaggerated response and perhaps aspects of metabolic derangement. So that's why I think it is important for the average person, for someone not managing a chronic disorder like epilepsy and things like that, that a strict ketogenic diet is probably not best for them. It's probably good for them to be metabolically flexible, to shift away from the standard, guidelines, which is super high carbohydrates, to more low to moderate carbohydrates, to get the body to burn fats, but to also maintain some higher level of insulin sensitivity and carb oxidation too. And then you can shift either way. You could fast for 3 or 4 days and feel totally fine. And then you could go to eating high fat and high carbohydrates. And then your metabolic biomarkers basically remain stable because you've trained your metabolism for that metabolic flexibility and you've opened up different metabolic pathways. As a bodybuilder, powerlifter, that when you train, you have muscle memory over time. If you work up to a 300-pound bench press or 400-pound bench press, and then you take 3 months off and you go back, your strength is going to be reduced by like 30% if you get back and start benching again. But it comes back, at least 3 times faster, right? The same thing happens with our metabolism. If we train our metabolism to be fat adapted, and then we go back to eating carbohydrates, when we go back to eating fat again, we get, since we've activated those metabolic pathways before and enzymatic pathways before, the body knows what to do, and you can quickly enter a state of ketosis again. We're just beginning to understand this now, so there's not a whole lot of research and data to support what I'm saying, but we see it in animal models. And then, from a perspective, anecdotal perspective, once people do a dietary strategy and like ketosis, for example, and get off of it and then go back in, they're in ketosis very fast. So there's this, what I call metabolic memory. So similar to muscle memory, there's metabolic memory, and that we are, even from an epigenetic standpoint, once we activate and sustain different metabolic pathways that had otherwise really not even been activated before, at least to a certain level, and we stop and start eating a certain way, and we go back to eating the other way, we adapt very quickly. And I think this metabolic flexibility you can train your body for that. And I think there's major advantages, physiological health benefits and performance advantages to metabolic flexibility. And Mike T. Nelson, I just did a podcast with him a few days ago. He has really kind of coined this term metabolic flexibility and has written about it quite a lot.
Yeah, he's writing about it for like 10 years or more.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. He's been a big practitioner of it. Yeah.
Yeah, correct. So let's switch to athletes. So we know that for endurance athletes, ketogenic diet, I mean, namely fat adaptation is a huge thing. And we know that since the 80s, because this is when Phil Maffetone started to play with the idea, right? So he already made his athletes fat adapted. And we talk about like almost 40 years ago.
Yeah.
But so that's, I think that's clear that they can have a great benefit from it. What about other people? What about other athletes that more like CrossFit athletes? So, you know, we call them as glycolytic athletes, whatever that means. Because there is this big fear that they're going to have a huge problem losing performance, namely. So how do you see that?
Well, one thing that's true about athletes that is not it doesn't parallel the general human population is that athletes, especially athletes with a lot of skeletal muscle and a lot of muscle in the frame, are extremely carbohydrate tolerant. And athletes that are performing at a high level really need to use all fuels available to them. Athletes that have a lot of muscle. Mm-hmm. So I think ideally you would want high level performing athletes to, during training, to sustain a lower carbohydrate diet and more towards a fat-based, low carb, perhaps even ketogenic at times diet, but to maintain a metabolic flexibility to when they add carbohydrates back in, those carbohydrates become a performance enhancing substrate. Mm-hmm. So they've trained their body, prevented perhaps, you know, physiological insulin resistance, but stayed in a mild state of ketosis, but occasionally added some, you know, low glycemic carbs, small amounts of carbs in and around their workouts. So what CrossFit athletes have done, some of them, not all of them, I've talked to quite a few, but they've consumed anywhere from 300 to 400 grams of carbs a day, some of the top athletes. And then there's others also performing at the top who just say 200 to 250 grams is more than enough, but their output is super high. Mm-hmm. So if you take, you know, the average couch potato American is supposed to get 200 or 300 grams of carbs. So they are essentially, it's all relative, right? By virtue of their skeletal muscle mass, their metabolisms, and their output, they are relatively low carbohydrate, many of the athletes, and performing pretty well. But I think it's important for them to utilize all fuels, and especially performing at such a high level, but maybe perhaps to train low carb and get their body fat adapted, and then they get some additional benefits, you know, from that fat adaptation.
And naturally, what you mentioned, fat adaptation, it's for an average person, it takes a couple of weeks, but for a high-level athletes, it's most likely 6, 7, 8, even 9 months probably.
Well, yeah, I mean, if they're already somewhat fat adapted, many high-performing athletes, right? But to change your metabolism sufficiently within that 2 to 3 percentile range of performance metrics that they're looking at, what we see with cyclists, with rowers, with runners, and even I think more so with like strength and anaerobic kind of sports athletes, is that it takes about six or more months to get to the level where you're reaching personal records. And not everybody's probably going to adapt the same way. And then there's a learning curve to the diet too. So there's a lot of things.
You have sponsors.
What's that?
And you have sponsors.
Oh yeah, you have sponsors.
So mainly I'm saying like probably they don't want you to lose for 6 months.
Yeah.
So probably you cannot really do the adaptation period, because if you keep losing, they will say like, well, no more money.
Yeah, unless they need a sufficient off season to be able to experiment with this
Yeah.
approach. I mean, they could do it more gradually and just start titrating the carbohydrates
Mhm.
down and adding, you know, maybe a little more fat, maybe more protein too, and adjusting things. But you know, I think with certain types of athletes, it may be favorable for them to keep carbohydrates in the diet because they are so carb tolerant to begin with,
Mhm.
but to periodically go into to do intermittent fasting and do ketogenic diets to get their body more fat adapted. But it's true. I mean, some people, obviously, some athletes thrive on a super high carb diet. If we go to endurance athletes, many endurance athletes, at least the ones that talk, you know, in the ketogenic circles, have switched from super high carb diet to a ketogenic diet and really experienced many benefits. Health benefits, recovery benefits have been pretty big. So, so there's, you know, probably a more favorable response to ultra endurance athletes switching to being fat adapted just by virtue of the recovery, bolusing glucose, you know, big spikes in your glucose when your body's under such high levels of oxidative stress and metabolic demands can wreak havoc on your body if that's protracted. You know, you basically have this protracted reactive oxygen species, inflammation storm, and over time, that's significantly attenuated if you're fat adapted being fueled off a ketogenic diet. You're attenuating these postprandial elevations in glucose and inflammatory things. I think you're augmenting the immune system in ways that's going to be efficacious to your performance, but also to your longevity in the sport.
Now, regarding to protein intake, because you said the ketone body is definitely has a muscle sparing effect, right?
Yep.
Well, it probably doesn't have a muscle building effect, but sparing for sure. Okay, right?
Yeah,
So,
well, under certain conditions, ketones can enhance the regenerative ability
mhm.
of muscles, at least in animal models. That's been shown. I think the jury's still out on that. But you know, protein, the amount of muscle you have is a constant cycle of catabolic anabolic pathways.
Yeah.
So there's a protein cycle, and if you inhibit the catabolic, then you have more, and anabolic is not increased. Your net result is that you accrue more muscle mass over time.
Mhm.
So, you know, even anabolic steroids may actually work through a catabolic mechanism. Insulin's probably more insulin's anti-catabolic and anabolic.
Mhm.
Yeah, so
But anabolic not in a way that it builds muscle just by per having insulin, but anabolic meaning it's building up. It's also about fat, right?
yeah, oh sure,
Yeah.
yep,
Okay. Okay. Just
yep.
making sure before any bodybuilder watching is like, oh, okay, I have to inject
Yeah.
a bunch of insulin. Okay.
No, insulin's incredibly lipogenic
Yes.
and probably maybe more lipogenic than it is, you know, anabolic. But the
Yes.
main thing is insulin sensitivity. So you want to
Mhm.
maintain a high level of insulin sensitivity, make sure that insulin receptor and downstream cascade
Mhm.
are amped up in ways. And as we age, that gets attenuated over time, and we call that anabolic resistance.
Mhm.
And a consequence of aging or age-related sarcopenia is anabolic resistance. And I think that ketogenic diets or low-carb diets could be a way to mitigate much of the anabolic resistance that
Mhm.
happens with time.
Mhm. So, but when we talk about ketogenic diet, everybody talks about the fat, of course, but nobody or not many people speaks about the the protein. So I'm sure you eat some, but you don't supplement. You take from food. I'm pretty sure. So probably now you see that there are a lot of people who are doing a carnivore diet, right?
Yeah.
Like Sean Baker and the others. So what do you think? Because so far the results are pretty amazing.
Yeah. Well, I think it depends on, you know, I, I I think the results are amazing in the people that are reporting it. And I think there's a lot of benefits to make a carnivore diet for some people,
Mm-hmm.
especially with autoimmune disorders.
Mm-hmm.
For performance, I'm a little bit you know, for ultra endurance and things like that, eating a massive amount of protein, fueling your body off protein, is not optimal, right? So what may work and which may even sustain health and improve certain health conditions is likely not, I could actually conclusively say, probably not optimal for performance or longevity, although there's probably significant advantages to a carnivore diet over like a standard American diet. Now, I'm going to say the same thing with the ketogenic diet. The ketogenic diet may improve many different disorders and be significantly better than the standard American diet in some respects, in some contexts, but could be suboptimal, could be far inferior to, you know, other diets in regards to performance. It really depends on the individual, what their goals are. But for me, I mean, you know, I don't suffer from epilepsy or seizures, so I could choose to eat whatever strategy. And I've measured many different variables from strength, from performance, from cognitive function, energy levels, blood biomarkers, everything you can measure. And I've settled on a low carb ketogenic diet, which is, in some days it's completely carnivore. Some days all I will eat is meat and eggs. And you know, I've done that for a week or so, not because like I tried to do it, but I'm traveling, or I don't know, I'm home and it's just like I run out of vegetables and I just have steak and eggs and fish. I eat a lot of fish.
And by the way, what I'm thinking, and again, I'm not an expert on that, but when we say carnivore diet, it doesn't mean lean meat. So most people think it's like steak with steak. But what I see, especially, you know, following Saladino or Baker, they're eating pretty fatty meat. So when you see it's fatty meat, it's probably, you know, still about 60-70% of fat.
Yeah,
in calories.
When I started following those guys, or they reached out to me, and I started watching, I became a little bit, you know, I didn't necessarily like the direction of just an all meat diet, but when I eliminate, I like broccoli, I like salads, I like vegetables. I have to admit that, you know, when I eat those things and I eliminate them and go a couple days just eating meat only, my energy levels don't drop, and aspects of my GI function are improved. So I'm just being honest, because a lot of times I try to justify eating, you know, I have arugula salads, asparagus, broccoli occasionally, but more like asparagus, and blueberries and dark chocolate and coffee. All these things are technically not like on the carnivore diet, but I enjoy these things. But when I eat less vegetables, interestingly, paradoxically, sometimes I do feel better.
Same with me. That's the funny thing. That's same with me. The only thing I have the only thing I have argument a little bit with those things is the milk part, because that can be, or cheese, that can be questionable for many people. But so far what I see as well, I have to agree with you that the GI part is huge.
Yeah. Do you eliminate dairy? So I tolerate dairy if it's sort of fermented, like a quality sour cream. But other than that, I can't drink milk. I typically stay away from yogurt even. I do have some protein powders or ketogenic. I have a keto meal product that has a little bit of milk protein, and that's fine. And I sprinkle some cheese on things, but I don't have a whole lot. I think these, you know, dairy in small amounts is completely okay with me. But if I go above a certain threshold, I start to feel the negative consequences.
Yeah, I think the problem.
Get congested.
I think the problem with the milk product is the source. That's the major part. That, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where do you get real milk? That's a big question always. So I don't trust in the industrial milk, you know, in a box. It doesn't make any sense to me. So your background is in breeding again. So we have a lot to discuss, or just a little bit, like, because I'm doing Buteyko, right? And I know you read some about that, right? So you researched it.
Yeah, right here. Yeah, right here. So yeah, I'm definitely up on it, and I'm a big advocate and a fan of that method. I admit that I've practiced it from time to time, but I need to be more
Hmm.
disciplined to really get the benefits of it. But it's like anything else,
Hmm.
right? You need to practice it over
Sure.
time. But I also believe that there's a memory that once you practice and practice and get to a certain
True.
level, you get back to that level real quick.
True.
Yep.
And what I wanted to ask from you that when we talk to doctors and we talk about hypoxia, and it's not well defined what type of hypoxia we are talking about. Of course, they will freak out because they're thinking about sleep apnea. They think about hypoxia in the tissues. So then the TNF alpha is high, interleukin 6 is high. So inflammation is just basically huge. Lactate is involved. So basically, they see the worst case scenario, right? But when we use acute, like intermittent hypoxic training, let's put it this way, then we know that somehow there is a lot of health benefits. We see with the Sherpas and other people, they are extremely slim and healthy. So do you see the same way as there's a difference between the chronic and all the time they're creating inflammation, but when you use it properly, like training, then
Mhm.
it's creating a good hormesis. Let's put it this way.
Yeah. I mean, it's like exercise, right? When you exercise and you're lifting in the gym and you feel the burn, that's hypoxia in your muscles,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you have chronic intermittent hypoxia training, which it's the adaptation to that stimulus that can confer benefits and make you more resilient,
Mm-hmm.
metabolically, physiologically resilient against a subsequent hypoxic challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And that's due to a number of epigenetic phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
There's an upregulation of oxygen carrying enzymes.
Mm-hmm.
Your hemoglobin, your red blood cell count may go up. There's enzymes like heme oxygenase 1, which is in the inducible form, and that can augment oxygen chemosensitivity
Mm-hmm.
and enhance oxygen utilization under certain conditions. Some enzymes, reactive oxygen species, are attenuated with this kind of training too. And by attenuating reactive oxygen species, that can mitigate the inflammatory cascades associated, classically associated with hypoxic insults. So with obstructive sleep apnea, what generally happens is that patients are overweight. Many times they have type 2 diabetes, not all of them, but the excess weight that they have can decrease airway patency. So the genioglossus muscle in the back will fall back if they have like a thick neck, especially you see it in people. So that limits airway patency. When we go to sleep, our serotonin levels plummet, and serotonin provides tonic input to the genioglossus muscle.
Mm-hmm.
So to maintain airway patency, a big drop in serotonin, which is lower in people who are obese, reduces tonic genioglossus muscle activation, and that airway patency is decreased. And then you have these hypoxic episodes that cause an increase in sympathetic activity over time, because you have arousals, periodic arousals that prevent the hypoxia. And chronic obstructive or obstructive sleep apnea can lead to hypertension. So you have activation of the sympathetic nervous system, and that can increase your blood pressure, your heart rate, and things like that. Breathing exercises really are a way to enhance oxygen chemosensitivity, and also CO2 chemosensitivity too, can also be enhanced and augmented in ways, with breathing exercises.
Because basically we talk about the ventilatory threshold, right? So somebody whose chemosensitivity is really low for CO2, they breathing frequency will go up, right? So that's through the Bohr effect. Basically, they start to create a hypoxic effect in the tissue. While in the same time the blood is filled with oxygen, right?
Yeah. So you're not unloading offloading the hemoglobin molecule.
So but when you reverse these things, so you start to uh, repair the Bohr effect, then suddenly the oxygen can go to the tissue, right? So then you have kind of eliminating the local hypoxia. And isn't that something very similar? I'm not saying the same, but very similar with the HBOT?
It's a little bit different. So
Because of the pressure, of course.
with what you're talking about, increasing with CO2 chemosensitivity, the CO2 is also a powerful vasodilator, right? So actually having a little more CO2 has a vasodilatory effect.
Correct. Yes.
And then so that's the whole point, like in Buteyko breathing, right? So you are unloading more oxygen. CO2 is a powerful vasodilator, and that can, by virtue of that, help to hyperoxygenate the tissue. So we know that with Carbogen, we could take, oxygen with a little bit of CO2 saturated with like 5% CO2.
Yeah.
That starts to get kind of high, but even 2 or 3%. And then that causes pretty profound vasodilation where you get headaches. And if it gets too high, it becomes uncomfortable. But the idea is that, you are shifting sort of this Bohr effect. With hyperoxia, if you just breathe 100% oxygen, right? Interestingly, your brain PO2 will go down. And that's due to hyperoxic vasoconstriction. But if you breathe 100% oxygen at increased barometric pressure, that will increase the tissue concentration of oxygen in the brain, because the oxygen is being transported independent of hemoglobin. The oxygen is being transported, hemoglobin saturated, so the oxygen is being transported in the plasma.
So that's only about 2%, right? But that's a lot.
Yeah, well, with hyperbaric oxygen therapy, I mean, it gets your brain, the partial pressure of oxygen in your brain is anywhere between, at the level of the mitochondria, it's like 2 millimolars of mercury or torr. It's very small, like 2 to maybe 35 millimeters of mercury, right? So under hyperbaric oxygen therapy, or if you're a diver, that can be as high as 1,000 millimeters of mercury.
Wow.
So that's a very high, actually that's what triggers oxygen toxicity seizures, because it becomes a stimulant, right? But we can use carbon dioxide to almost achieve the same thing in our tissues. So we can hyperoxygenate our tissues by leveraging carbon dioxide. That's something we're interested in doing in the lab. But also, if you're breathing high oxygen and you're underwater, and then your breathing circuit becomes contaminated with carbon dioxide, that vasodilation can increase oxygenation to a point where it becomes toxic. So I study it from the context of that, but if you study it from the context of Buteyko breathing, then you're leveraging carbon dioxide actually to be a health promoting, tissue oxygenating, gas.
Yeah, and very, very interesting. We use with athletes. And it creates amazing effect. Of course, there is a time where they have to adapt to the load. Of course, there's a short adaptation and there is a long-term adaptation. Yeah, but that's pretty amazing to see that. So when you mentioned HBOT, the hyperbaric oxygen chambers therapy, then basically, as I understand, there are people who are using also for cancer therapy, but not for the necrosis, what you mentioned before, because people got burned, let's put it this way. Yeah. But they're using with ketogenic diet, right?
Yeah.
Possibly with some of the protocol from Professor Thomas Seyfried with some of the glutamine inhibitors, right?
Yeah.
And then the HBOT. So do you see this as a feasible 1, 2, 3 punch, basically, let's put it this way, against cancer?
Yeah, hyperbaric oxygen by itself doesn't really have robust anti-cancer effects. We didn't see much in our animal models using hyperbaric oxygen alone, although we saw some trends maybe, but it wasn't statistically significant. But when hyperbaric oxygen therapy is coupled with the ketogenic diet, then you have suppression of insulin signaling. So that's at least slowing cancer growth and proliferation. You have decreased glucose availability to the tumor and elevation of ketone bodies, which are marginalized in cancer tissue. Cancer cells cannot really derive a lot of energy, if at all, from ketone bodies, maybe for anabolic processes, but it's not, ketones do not fuel cancer, at least from an energetic standpoint. That's important to recognize. And by limiting glucose availability, you're limiting something called the pentose phosphate pathway. And the pentose phosphate pathway generates reduced glutathione. And if you're, if you hit cancer cells with if you hyperoxygenate cancer cells in the context of a ketogenic diet, it can overwhelm their antioxidant capacity because you're inhibiting the pentose phosphate derived glutathione. And it's doing that much like radiation therapy, but in a way that's not damaging to the normal healthy tissue. And that's what's really important here. So in a solid tumor, we think that if you produce a metabolic state, which is a glucose ketone index, for example, the level of glucose is essentially lowered and the levels of ketones elevated to where they're about the same ratio in the blood. That produces a remarkable therapeutic effect. We know it works remarkably well to control seizures, but it also has very powerful anti-angiogenic, pro-apoptotic, anti-proliferative effects, right? Produce that metabolic state in the body systemically, and then treat that person in that metabolic state with hyperbaric oxygen therapy, and you have a very powerful anti-cancer protocol just by those two non-toxic methods. And those two things alone may not be enough to kill the cancer, or definitely not enough to probably eradicate the cancer. If it's doing it, it's doing it slowly over time, but it makes the cancer vulnerable to other modalities that can kill the cancer. So that could be chemotherapy, radiation. I know Thomas Seyfried does not like those approaches, but I think—
Would that be a lower dose in that case?
Yes, you could use a lower dose.
That's already good.
We have an expanding toolbox of metabolic drugs too, like PI3 kinase inhibitors that Lou Cantley is working on. Interestingly, they only work in the context of a ketogenic diet because these drugs can, through augmenting counter-regulatory mechanisms, they tend to spike insulin. So if you suppress insulin with a ketogenic diet, while you're using these PI3 kinase inhibitors, that can unleash its cancer-killing effects. So we're realizing now that many therapies which did not work on their own may be augmented significantly or dramatically enhanced in the context of a ketogenic diet or a metabolic therapy. So this is really important information, and I think it's how individuals like us, like Thomas Seyfried and me and other people who study this, get this therapy into the clinic. So by convincing oncologists that, your therapy is great, and, not convincing them that your therapy is damaging or killing the patient, but we can make your therapy work better. And then over time, we develop protocols that are completely non-toxic. And I think that's the direction we want to go, but it becomes, we have to do this in steps. And I think we have to, the data is already, when I started studying this, there was like one ketogenic diet study on clinicaltrials.gov, and now there's like 30 or more. So the data is starting to accumulate that ketogenic diets are safe, they increase the quality of life, and they tend to augment other forms of standard of care therapy.
And is that true, using this on dogs for the petsanctuary.com, right? I think these are the guys.
Keto Pet
They
Sanctuary.
they are making some amazing results. Is that true?
Yeah, they have evolved over the years. They were using hyperbaric oxygen therapy. Then it becomes kind of difficult to implement that, in a lot of dogs over time and stick to protocols. But a lot of times if a dog has surgery, it would also enhance their wound healing process. But I'd encourage people to go to the website, ketopetsanctuary.com. And they have, because I get a lot of emails about people that want to treat their dogs. And what they do, they have a step-by-step guideline and an ebook, a free ebook that you can download. And in addition to that, the staff at Keto Pet or Epigenics, which is really driving the foundation, is really assisting people with being able to implement these ketogenic strategies for their dogs. And many dogs have gone through these programs, have been scanned. They've presented the information at a number of different conferences, including the Metabolic Therapeutics Conference, which is now Metabolic Health Summit. Or Health Symposium. Which, hopefully we can have again if the COVID-19 restrictions are lifted. We hope to bring everybody together again for this, and hope that we could see you there too if you're able to travel.
But aren't these people at KetoPath Sanctuary, they making some crazy results, right? So what I saw last time, the percentage of remission, that was really eye-opening.
Yeah, they've had so different cancers respond differently, but they've been able to treat a number of cancers that have been resistant to, classically resistant to therapy with this approach, metabolic therapy. And they're using the ketogenic diet is sort of like the baseline therapy that you do first. And they've observed that, similar to what Thomas Seyfried has observed, that you have to restrict overall calories too. So you unleash the anti-cancer benefits of the ketogenic diet, especially in dogs, if you moderate and restrict the calories. Because sometimes, unlike humans, dogs, if you give them an unlimited access to a ketogenic diet, they'll overeat it. And so it has to be weighed out. My former student, Dr. Shannon Kessel, worked there and was a big part of the staff and helping to collect the data and feed the dogs, take care of the dogs. So, yeah, they're making great strides, and we hope that, over time that this can be, evolved to the standard of care in helping to treat dogs and maybe all pets or many pets with ketogenic diet therapies.
Now, I have only the last two questions. So one of them is about exogenous ketones. So I know that you are one of those who really boosted the research. Mm-hmm. So where do you see the place right now for an average person for exogenous ketones?
Yeah, I view them as a tool in the toolbox for performance, for wellness, for energy, like in general. And, I have access to exogenous ketones, I have different products around me. I can take them whenever.
These are brands you've been working with actively as a scientist, probably?
Yeah. So the research that we do here in the lab has evolved to different patents, and then our university has control of those patents, and we'll have different licensing partners to use the different formulas that we develop. And I have them on ketonutrition.org. I try not to favor any particular company, but what we do is we test them. I test them on myself. We test them, the formulations in animal model studies. And I put the products that I use personally and that I use on a daily basis on ketonutrition.org website. And I think they do really offer a distinct advantage to many people following a low-carb ketogenic diet, because they are a source of calories, of superior energy. They can be consumed, and under doses that are on the label, they have essentially no insulin response unless you consume a massive amount of a ketone ester. Then and you get your millimolar concentration, a delta above like 2 or 3 millimolar. Then it starts to stimulate insulin. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but you can consume these products, and they are, I think of them as kind of like creatine, right? If you take creatine, it helps your body generate ATP under certain conditions, anaerobic conditions. Exogenous ketones help to augment energy production, at any given time. And if you're at your desk, if you're running, if you're at the gym, they could be used, and you could derive benefits under a wide variety of different scenarios. And most importantly, from my perspective, is there are people who are unwilling or unable to follow a ketogenic diet, and the motivation behind the development of exogenous ketones were for metabolic management of seizure disorders and also cancer. But first and foremost, probably metabolic mitigation of oxygen toxicity seizures.
Mm-hmm.
So the funding mechanism behind most of the research that we did to develop exogenous ketones came from the military, the
Mm-hmm.
Office of Navy Research.
As normally it comes from the military.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
So basically the benefits for these kind of ketone products is, we can say that most probably it gives you energy, probably helping with the transition period from starting the ketogenic diet until you have full adaptation. Would that be fair?
Yeah, they could definitely help people transitioning that may be getting cravings and things. They have an appetite suppressing effect. They change the neuropharmacology of your brain in ways that may be contributing to appetite regulation.
Mm-hmm.
I just know when I fasted for 3 days and my ketones get up to like 3 or 4 millimolar without any kind of supplementation at all. I mean, it's remarkable how I don't have any appetite at all.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be suppression of insulin but I think a lot of it has to do with ketones basically keeping your brain happy. So it's doing 2 things. It's giving your brain a source of energy. And if your brain is not undergoing an energetic crisis from glucose withdrawal, then that does not trigger the cravings to go eat. So it's all about when you transition into a ketogenic diet, or maybe when you start fasting, you may have these cravings because your brain is going through a very uncomfortable phase of glucose withdrawal. Yes. And adding ketones forms small amounts of exogenous ketones, or maybe you might need a full dose. That can help attenuate those cravings, and it can be a really effective tool for that. And you still maintain that those biomarkers that are associated with fasting, you might be getting like all the benefits of fasting. Because when you increase your blood ketone levels with exogenous ketones, it tends to lower your glucose too. And there could be some benefits to that we're looking into.
So generally, ketones has effect on inflammation, right?
Yeah.
Is there?
Moderate to low levels of ketones definitely have been shown to have an anti-inflammatory effect in some model systems. So it becomes a little, so in type 1 diabetes, if your ketone levels are really high and your glucose is high, diabetic ketoacidosis has been associated with a pro-inflammatory state.
Sure.
But that's because your glucose is high too. But in the context of a healthy state of ketosis, or what I call nutritional ketosis, in moderate to low levels where you have low insulin, low glucose, and elevated ketones, that metabolic state, in part by virtue of the ketone bodies, is producing a low state of inflammation. And you can measure it using C-reactive protein, or high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, which, when I started doing the ketogenic diet, my C-reactive protein went from like 1.5 or 2 to almost non-detectable over time. And that really, I didn't even adjust my calories at all. So that was like a eukcaloric diet transitioning to low carb ketogenic over time. C-reactive protein like 0.1, 0.2. Only if I go off of the diet will my C-reactive protein come up. So
would that be true if somebody's following a pretty good low carb diet with exogenous ketones? I'm not saying you say that it does, but is that logical that probably the CRP would go down again?
We're looking at that now. I would say the science is producing a kind of theoretical framework that would happen, that if people are following a normal diet and incorporate exogenous ketones into their normal diet, that we would predict, based upon the science, that it will be influencing biomarkers of metabolic health that would be associated with a lower hemoglobin A1C, lower insulin, and also by virtue of increasing insulin sensitivity, and also lower inflammatory state.
That's pretty amazing.
The data is indicating that, and I think I'm a big fan of nutrition and diet. So the main
Mm,
thing should always be diet, but supplements are just that. They're supplements. But what we're realizing now is that a supplement like a ketone supplement is not only a fuel, like you would think of creatine or
mhm,
Gatorade or something like that as a form of energy, but they have very powerful hormone-like signaling properties.
mhm.
And we don't fully understand it yet, but we know it's happening, and we're doing the research to figure out how it's happening.
And the last question, because I'm pretty sure my wife will watch this.
Mhm.
So, and she's American, and your
Yeah.
wife is Hungarian. So she will
Yeah.
ask me, did you ask him, how did they meet? And
Great.
I have to answer this question, my friend.
So my wife actually is going to have her U.S. citizenship ceremony,
Mm,
hopefully tomorrow, if everything
wow.
goes well. So it was unexpectedly. We met working at the university on a confocal microscope. So my wife is, a behavioral neuroscientist, and
Mhm.
she was working at the Alzheimer's Center here on campus. And she was analyzing some cells, and we had a mutual friend who is also a scuba diver, and he introduced me to her back in 2010. And so we've been together for 10 years now, over 10 years. And we became friends, and we started hanging out, and after a couple months we started dating. And I've been fascinated with Hungary and Budapest, and we've traveled all over in Hungary, and we've had many great experiences here traveling around the world. And I've really gained an appreciation for Hungary and Budapest too, and meeting you and all the folks.
Thank you.
There's so many amazing people in Hungary, and scientists like Dr. Boris Latzi,
Yes.
who I'm sure you know too. Yeah,
Oh, absolutely.
yeah, yeah. So there's, I find the Hungarians to be some of the smartest individuals on the planet, in regards
Thank
to
you.
science and biochemistry. And it's super fascinating to meet with them. And uh,
Appreciate that.
yeah, and
Well,
she's been a
you
great
have to
scientist.
say this now because you have a Hungarian wife. I get it.
Yeah, yeah, that's true too. And well, she does not follow a ketogenic diet, but she appreciates like the ketogenic
Mhm.
diet. She'll like fast from time to time too. But she's a very high carbohydrate tolerance.
Mhm.
So she continues to stick with some of the traditional Hungarian foods, which she'll have maybe a couple times a week. And she cooks them for me, and even have made like low carb or ketogenic versions of some of the
Nice.
Hungarian foods.
Very nice. So, thank you for your time, first of all. I really appreciate that, all the effort you put into these answers. And I personally, I learned a lot, so I really appreciate that. I hope we can have sometimes this as part two
Yeah,
as well.
absolutely. Yep. Lots.
And even better, I hope we're going to meet in Budapest sometimes in the next
Yeah.
year or this year. And that will be even better. So then we're going to bring you some fat fry, that töpörtyű. So I know you
Yeah.
like that one.
I love that.
I know.
It's like my favorite food. Yeah.
Yes. So I really appreciate your time and thank you again.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. We'd love to do part two whenever
Thank
you're
you.
ready.
Thanks.